Welcome to Engineered Gene Drives, Regulatory and Policy Considerations. This is a webinar series brought to you by the GeneConvene Global Collaborative, and I'm glad you have been able to join us this morning, evening, or afternoon. My name is Hector Kimata, and I, along with my colleague David DeBrocta, will be hosting and moderating this series. Before our speakers, Ms. Wadzi Mandivenyi and Dr. Marion Law begin their presentations, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the GeneConvene Global Collaborative and make a few remarks about this and upcoming webinars. The GeneConvene Global Collaborative is an initiative within the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health. It's arisen from and is an extension of the FNIH's longtime involvement in the vector-borne disease space. The potential of genetic biocontrol and gene drive technologies specifically to contribute to the reduction and even the elimination of human malaria, for example, as well as other urgent public health challenges is substantial, although with considerable uncertainty. The responsible exploration of these technologies will enable us to evaluate their efficacy and safety and see if, in fact, these technologies can fulfill their potential and be used in ways that those researching and developing them claim they can. The GeneConvene Global Collaborative works to advance the safe, ethical, and rigorous exploration of gene drive and other genetic biocontrol technologies. And it does this by trying to anticipate emerging issues and to facilitate the development of guidance and best practices through consensus building. GeneConvene also seeks to offer accurate information, advice, and technical support for the purposes of fostering responsible approaches to research and governance of gene drive and other genetic biocontrol technologies for public health. This webinar series is part of that effort, and I encourage you to learn more about the GeneConvene Global Collaborative by visiting fnih.org/GeneConvene. The GeneConvene Global Collaborative has also created the GeneConvene Virtual Institute, which is a knowledge resource that aggregates, tracks, organizes, and shares the latest about gene drive from scholarship and research to media reports to policy and regulatory documents. The Virtual Institute is striving to create a resource where those interested in gene drive and genetic biocontrol can come and learn about these classes of technologies. To help those who are interested in these areas of research and development keep up with the accelerating activity in this space, the Virtual Institute publishes a weekly newsletter that notifies you of and points you to new scholarship, media reports, etc., related to gene drive and genetic biocontrol. Check it out, and I also encourage you to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention that the GeneConvene Virtual Institute is currently seeking to hire a web assistant on a contractor basis to develop and maintain the Virtual Institute's digital presence. Now, let me say something briefly about this webinar series and others to follow. This particular series of 5 webinar topics, the topics which you see here, follow the previous ones focused on the science, and this one will focus on regulations, policy, and governance. And it's intended to explore different aspects and viewpoints on those topics. We hope this series will stimulate much thought and discussion and stimulate interest in exploring these issues further. Suggestions on other topics to explore are welcome. I'd like now to just go over a few housekeeping issues and just remind you that, first of all, for any technical issues that you might experience during this webinar, please contact FNIH events at fnih.org. The presentations, there will be 2 of them today. They will total about 60 minutes. Please feel free to use the chat function at any time during the 2 talks. But we will be addressing those questions after both presentations are done. This session will end after 90 minutes, or just a little after 12:30 US Eastern Time. Remaining questions that we weren't addressed in this webinar will be addressed offline and will be will be, and then the responses will be also posted online. This presentation will be recorded and will be posted along with those responses to all questions at the website, GeneConveneVI.org. So I'd like now to introduce our two speakers, Ms. Wadzi Mandivenyi from the Convention on Biological Diversity, and Dr. Marion Law from the World Health Organization. First, Ms. Wadzi Mandivenyi has worked on the biotechnology, biosafety, and biodiversity sector for the past 24 years. In 2005, she joined the South African government as a biosafety regulator, where she oversaw the development of environmental risk assessment and biosafety policy at the national and regional levels. And in addition, in 2012, she was appointed as the senior manager responsible for promoting international cooperation for biodiversity, as well as monitoring and reporting and bridging the science and policy interface. Prior to joining the South African government, she worked in the development sector for stakeholder organizations on biotechnology in Zimbabwe and South Africa. She holds a Master of Science degree in molecular genetics from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, and an honors degree in biological sciences from the University of Zimbabwe. Dr. Marion Law, the team lead for the vector control products team at WHO, is a microbiologist with research experience in the area of antibiotic and microbial resistance. Before joining WHO 3 years ago, she held a number of senior executive positions in Health Canada, which included leading health product evaluation, science policy development, and regulatory science operations in the areas of pharmaceuticals, medical devices, controlled drugs and substances, blood products, and biotechnology drugs, as well as pesticides and pest control products. As a previous chief registrar of the Pest Management Regulatory Agency of Health Canada, and more recently, Director General of the Therapeutics Products Directorate, Health Canada, she has extensive international experience, including as head of the Canadian delegation to the North American Free Trade Agreement, and also to the OECD, where she was the chair of the OECD Working Group on Pesticides. Thank you both for joining us today. I'm going to be advancing the slides for both speakers today. So whenever you're ready, Wadzi, if you're ready, please let me know and I will proceed with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Hector, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. And thank you for this opportunity that you provided to the Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity to contribute to your deliberations and share our perspective on this very important issue. We welcome the opportunity to discuss with stakeholders such as yourselves and really find that these inputs that you will make are important for maintaining the momentum in the international discourse and also for providing clarity, conceptual clarity, and creating an enabling environment for regulators and our negotiations. To the next slide, please. And so my presentation today will essentially focus on the relevant work that is happening under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And my colleague will look at the work under the World Health Organization. And there's also work on this topic happening under the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. I will not be speaking to that, but just to highlight that these are 3 international platforms where discussions on gene drives are advancing. And also to indicate that the science policy interface for gene drives is very complex, and we are finding ourselves in a state where regulatory systems are needing to catch up with the scientific developments and also needing to be adapted in order to respond to the technological advancements. And as gene drive research continues to advance, the scientific community, such as yourselves and regulators, will really need to work together to customize existing systems and to try out and adapt and create a better working system that will then influence the global policy engagement. Just to emphasize that the Convention on Biological Diversity is the preeminent biodiversity convention, and it's one of the 3 Rio conventions, and it currently has 196 member states. It is supported by 3 protocols: the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which has 173 parties, the Nagoya Protocol with 128 parties, and the Nagoya Kuala Lumpur Supplementary Protocol that has 48 parties. And again, in the context of these discussions, a lot of the work is happening around the convention itself, as well as the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. And at some point, we will need to also consider what are the implications for the Nagoya Kuala Lumpur Supplementary Protocol on Liability and Redress. Next slide. So basically, the mandate for the discussions and the point of reference for the Convention on Biological Diversity comes from the 3 objectives of the agreement of the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the Cartagena Protocol. The specific provisions in the Convention on Biological Diversity put an obligation on the 196 parties to establish systems to manage risks to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity that may result from biotechnology. The Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety essentially sets to contribute to ensuring an adequate level of protection in the field of the safe transfer, handling, and use of living modified organisms that result from modern biotechnology. And this work is underpinned through an Annex 3 of the Cartagena Protocol, which provides the basis for risk assessment methodology for all activities. And this risk assessment annex provides the basis that many of the gene drive experiments and work would then need to follow. Next slide. So in terms of the CBD process overall, essentially discussions have been ongoing for the past 10 years, initially under the agenda item on synthetic biology and introduced under a topic called New and Emerging Issues Relating to Conservation and Sustainable Use of Biodiversity. This discussion and deliberation is still ongoing. Gene drives feature prominently under the synthetic biology discussions of the CBD. More recently, they have started to also feature in the scope of the Cartagena Protocol topics under the risk assessment and risk management discussions. Naturally so, given that Annex 3 provides the basis for the risk assessments that would be undertaken. In 2012, a report that was compiled by the Ad Hoc Technical Expert Group on Risk Assessment included a discussion on mosquitoes that have the modified gene drive. And this document is published and available on the website of the Secretariat, and it's called the Guidance Document on Risk Assessment of Living Modified Mosquitoes. Further on, in 2018, a parallel program of work under the Cartagena Protocol was determined, which was established, which will then be determining whether or not there is a need for specific guidance to be developed on gene drives. Next slide. So as I indicated, the Convention on Biological Diversity has been working on this area of work for the last 10 years. And as a result, a number of decisions have been adopted by the parties to the convention. These decisions are related to recognition of synthetic biology, and then further decisions that looked at the need for precaution, regulatory systems, and the socioeconomic aspects of synthetic biology, and also the establishment of an ad hoc technical experts group. And then further decisions were taken as a program of work developed under the convention, and then the latest and most current decision, which was taken in 2018 by the 14th Conference of the Parties. And I will elaborate on this decision in the next slide. So decision 14 is the current decision, which is the program of work which we have been busy with in the biennial. And this process, I must clarify that this process under the convention is looking at a set of activities under the topic of synthetic biology. However, under this topic, certain elements concerning gene drives have been incorporated. So the decision 14 has a specific component that deals with issues surrounding gene drives. This decision urges precaution, and it reinforces the need to seek the free, prior, and informed consent or approval from all potentially impacted communities and indigenous peoples before considering environmental release of gene drive organisms. The decision also places 3 important preconditions before release of gene drives on state parties. And these preconditions relate to the need to do a risk assessment, the need to ensure that risk management measures are in place to prevent or minimize adverse effects, as well as the need to seek the consent of potentially affected indigenous peoples and local communities. The decision has a third component, which notes that the release of gene drives may affect traditional knowledge, innovation, practices, livelihoods, and use of land and water of indigenous peoples and local communities. The next slide. As I indicated, the convention has an extensive program of work on synthetic biology, which makes also references to gene drives in particular. And the synthetic biology component of the decision has 3 specific areas of work which are of relevance to a discussion on gene drives. It asked for a submission of information on specific topics of synthetic biology, including gene drives, and all in all, a total of 28 submissions were made by parties and other organizations. And these submissions included those applications that involve organisms containing engineered gene drives, taking into account the traits, the species potentially subject to release, and the dynamics of their dissemination. To support this decision, further work was done under the open-ended online forum on synthetic biology to support the work of the ad hoc technical experts group. A specific topic was convened for discussions by the open-ended online forum, and this topic looked at the review of the current state of knowledge on the potential positive and negative environmental impacts of current and near future applications of synthetic biology, including those applications that involve organisms containing engineered gene drives. This information was consolidated and is available on the website of the Convention on Biological Diversity for more information. And this information then was discussed by the ad hoc technical experts group. I must at this point also stress that we have two ad hoc technical expert groups that are working in parallel on topics related to gene drive. The first one being the synthetic biology ATEC, and this ATEC is comprised of experts nominated by parties, and it also ensures regional representation. The next slide. And there, regarding the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, and as I said, it's been in recent years that the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety has taken on this issue and developed a parallel program of work, which is complementary to the work under the synthetic biology discussions. And the key decision under the Cartagena Protocol is decision 9 of 913. And this decision has a number of elements, which included the commissioning of a study on risk assessment, application of Annex 1 to living modified organisms containing engineered gene drives. The study has been undertaken and is also available. The decision also looks at and provides an opportunity for Annex 1 to be applied to the criteria for determining whether or not a topic should have specific guidance developed and for prioritization of the topics. And the gene drive topic was taken through these criteria by the ATEC, and the various elements were undertaken, and the risk assessment and risk management ATEC recommendations have been forwarded to SBSTA for further consideration on the need to develop specific guidance on gene drives. And this will be discussed under COPMOP 10 in 2021. The next slide. The decision on decision 913 also includes a stock taking exercise, which looked at the various work that is happening globally of relevance to the topic, and a set of references is available also on the website, and this gives you a perspective of some of the other international work that is underway. Next slide. So from where the convention is sitting at the moment, there is emerging consensus on the following aspects. Essentially, that in order to respond to gene drives at a global level, it will require a global endeavor. The current examples that we have for gene drive organisms show that the research and development is taking place in the developed countries, while the field testing and the relevance of the organisms is in developing countries. This means that an international platform provided by the Convention on Biological Diversity will be important in looking at a global regulatory framework. The diversity of gene drive systems, as well as the possible applications, also will necessitate a case-by-case approach. Again, there's growing consensus that countries may need regional cooperation in relation to risk assessment. And this cooperation would then be advanced through the work of the ATECs and the other structures that the convention provides. There's also a general consensus that organisms containing engineered gene drives are living modified organisms, and they fall within the scope of the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. And finally, there's agreement that the perspective of local communities and indigenous groups potentially affected by such releases should be paramount in the discussions and the deliberations that are undertaken. Next slide. So in conclusion, I would just like to highlight the next steps that would be undertaken under the auspices of the convention and the protocol. There's an open-ended working group on post-2020 global biodiversity framework. This work is ongoing, and there's an opportunity for parties to raise issues and ensure that a global system is incorporated in those deliberations. COP15, which is scheduled to take place in 2021, will include an in-depth review of the synthetic biology program of work under the convention and provide further guidance on the way forward and respond to whether or not synthetic biology meets the parameters of a new and emerging issue. The upcoming meetings of the subsidiary body on scientific and technical advice to the Conference of Parties, the 24th meeting, will consider the risk assessment ATEC report and make recommendations to COP10. And this is regarding further developments of guidance on gene drives. And then it is anticipated that both the Conference of the Parties and COP10 may request any other additional work to be done in this area of work. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you the work underway under the convention and the protocol. Thank you.
Thank you, Wadzi, for that very enlightening and very informative presentation. I would like to encourage the viewers now also to continue to think about questions that they might have about this presentation and write them out in chat so that we can deal with them in the question and answer period. In the meantime, then, I would like to next move to our next speaker, Marion Law, who will be covering the WHO process regarding gene drives. Marion, you may proceed.
Thank you, Hector, and thank you very much to Hector and the organizing committee for this invitation to participate in this very important discussion. I'd like to just wish a good morning and a good afternoon and a good evening to all participants, and just to say that WHO welcomes this opportunity not only to hear, and the very informative presentation from Wadzi before me, but also to hear the questions and the discussions that may come from this, this presentation. I was asked to come and talk to you about the WHO evaluation of new classes of vector control products. So that assessment in itself, that evaluation process in itself is actually quite new. So I look forward to sharing aspects of that with you. But also I thought it might be a good idea to talk about the new classes, the new process as it stands, and then discuss with you or share with you some of the ideas that we have for incorporating some of the newer elements that we would need to for new innovative vector control products. So next slide, please. So what I'd like to cover today is just very briefly, because it's very helpful for WHO, just to define and state the purpose of regulation, talk a little bit about the WHO guidance for the evaluation of genetically modified mosquitoes, and then move to the process that we have in place for the evaluation of new classes of vector control products. And that will include GMMs, And then maybe focus a little bit on the area of WHO that I come from and I lead. That's the pre-qualification process, because I believe that it may actually be a bit of an unknown quantity to a number of you, because it's a fairly new evaluation process for vector control products in WHO, as it has superseded the previous WUPI's approach. And then maybe end with some factors to consider for the PQ evaluation of genetically modified mosquitoes. So next slide, please. Very briefly, it's always, I've spent 30 years of my life in regulation, so for me, this is vitally important. And it must be defined, and I apologize for most, because most of you will know what this is. But a regulation is a principle or a rule, with or without the power of laws, employed in controlling, directing, or managing activity and organization of a system. The reason I want to raise this is because WHO is not usually considered as an organization that conducts a regulatory function. It's absolutely more known for its norms and standards and guidance to member states. That's our key role. However, when we look at the definition of a regulation, controlling, directing, or managing, and then we look at the fact that WHO does evaluate health products, medicines, vaccines, diagnostics, and since 2017, vector control products, it's very clearly performing a regulatory function. We provide guidance, we provide or we state the data requirements, we analyze that data, and we make a recommendation or a decision. And in the case of a pre-qualification decision, that actually authorizes the use of that product in any country that are, or for the procurement agencies and the countries to use if they see fit. So I would say that just to state that, WHO certainly does provide this regulatory function in as well as developing the norms and standards. The next slide, please. Now, the purpose of regulation, if you're in a country, we know that these regulations are developed from legal interpretations of enacted legislation. They're usually implemented by government ministries or agencies under the authority of that legislation. And their main purpose is to translate the legislation into actions. For example, if we're talking about health products, that's setting out the actions required of the responsible parties to ensure that the product is safe for its intended use, it's effective, and it meets established manufacturing and testing standards. So WHO, of course, doesn't have legislation. It's a global organization, but it does have in place its mandate, its norms and standards and procedures document. So again, there is plenty of room for a regulatory-like function within the work of WHO. Next slide, please. I would just like very briefly, because I think a lot of you will be familiar with these documents, and only just last week, WHO held a webinar, and I think a lot of you would have been participating in that, where we released the position statement on the evaluation of genetically modified mosquitoes for control of vector-borne diseases. That's WHO's position on the evaluation and the use of these interventions. Also, at the same time, the guidance document on ethics and vector-borne diseases was launched, a critical document that many different experts, countries, organizations were involved with the development of, and it identifies the relevant ethical considerations that must be taken into account in the management of vector-borne diseases. And then the last document, which is the one that probably I'll refer to more today, hasn't yet been launched, but the guidance framework for testing of genetically modified mosquitoes, the first version was in 2014, and a new revised version will be released very soon. And these guidance documents, as well as the other documents that Wadzi has talked about earlier today, the Cartagena protocol, for example, these documents form the framework for the evaluation of new interventions, in particular GMM vector control products within WHO. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to just take you through the evaluation process for vector control products. This is a process, so sometimes it's not quite as interesting, obviously, as the technical aspect of it, but nonetheless, I want to take you through this and indicate to you how important the process will be for moving through the different processes and reflecting the work that is in the guidance documents and needs to be done for the evaluation of these products. So next slide, please. In WHO, the overall, the larger evaluation pathway falls under 3 departments: the global, the Department of Neglected Tropical Diseases, the Global Malaria Program, and the Prequalification Department. And these departments work together to evaluate vector control process and actually vector control products and manage the whole process. The first part of the process is very key in the step and would be applicable to any product evaluation or application that came into WHO, and that would be the determination of pathway. Because the determinant pathway could be one of 2 pathways. First could be the new intervention pathway or the pre-qualification pathway. And that is all determined on if WHO has a policy in place which covers the use of the product or the new intervention for vector control. If after discussions with the 3 departments involved and looking at the information that the manufacturer, the product developer, or the researchers have provided, if there is a policy in place that would support the use, that product would go straight to the pre-qualification pathway. If there was no policy in place, it would go through another part of the pathway, which is called the new intervention pathway. And I think at this point, although I'm talking about the broader process, we would mention here that without a doubt, any application coming in for a product developed from genetically modified organisms would most definitely go through the new intervention pathway. Next slide, please. So I will talk a little bit about this pathway. There's a lot to be said, and maybe it's a presentation in itself, but just for the purposes of today, first of all, and I think I mentioned, this is the pathway where a determination is made to see to demonstrate if the product can be used for public health value, if there is value associated to use of the product. This pathway is managed by the disease departments involved, Department of Neglected Tropical Diseases and the Global Malaria Program. And of course, it is supported by advice and recommendations from the WHO Vector Control Advisory Group. The advice and the recommendations from VCAG, as it's known, on the public health value of the product is based on studies assessing epidemiological endpoints. These recommendations are published in the VCAG meeting report. It's transparent, and the input from these recommendations is used in the development of a WHO policy, which would cover that class of product. Next slide, please. So after, if the product goes through the new intervention pathway and through the processes set out for VCAG, there is the pre-qualification pathway that also must be followed as well. But that pathway normally is initiated when the public health value is already determined. So after the work is done looking at the epidemiological endpoints and the studies associated with that, once a policy is recommended and it exists, then pre-qualification would initiate an assessment of the safety of the product, the entomological efficacy, the quality, that's the manufacturing, and the chemical and manufacturing attributes, and the production, And all the associated documents are also assessed. That's the labeling, the risk management plans, promotional material, if appropriate. Sometimes the pre-qualification pathway is brought in a little bit earlier than normal, and that would probably be the case more for a new intervention. If the disease department supported by VCAG wanted an assessment of the supporting data for a product that would be used in trials, ready to be implemented to determine public health value, that would be maybe an information to assess the product for investigational purposes or experimental purposes, then the pre-qualification pathway would take that on and look at a much smaller data set, looking at the safety associated with using that product. Is there enough efficacy data, effectiveness data to support that it should go further, and also some manufacturing data associated with the actual product that would be used in these trials. Now, this doesn't often happen, because if we're looking at, if VCAG are looking at a product that has a known chemical, for example, a known product design, there really isn't a need for that investigational application to be done. But there are circumstances when that must be done. Usually it is around the safety, and that's been done before. But I think if I bring in a new intervention and one, for example, the genetically modified mosquitoes, most certainly there would have to be, and the guidance by WHO sets out that there would need to be some kind of investigational assessment of information before any trials. So that would be an adjustment on the process. For the pre-qualification pathway, the assessments are conducted by an expert group, which includes toxicologists, entomologists, product chemists, material chemists, and risk management experts. And there are quite lengthy decision documents of these pre-qualified products, and they are prepared within WHO, and they also are publicly available on the pre-qualified list of vector control products. Next slide, please. So if I was just to give you a very simplified version of this evaluation using a genetically modified mosquito, for example, you would see the three departments that are involved with this: the pre-qualification, GMP, NTD. Pre-qualification will take care of the quality, safety, efficacy, and there may be an evaluation of that before this would go to VCAG, or depending on the product, not. And then global malaria program and neglected tropical diseases very much focus with the vector control advisory group on the impact of the disease. Next slide, please. I would like to, as I said at the beginning in the outline, and sorry, I'm kind of jumping about here, I would like to talk a little bit about the mandate of pre-qualification, because as I said, not many people know about this new program in WHO, and it does lend itself perhaps more, well, it should lend itself more to encouraging new innovation in vector control, because that really was the reason for the evaluation of vector control products to move from WUPIs into pre-qualification, to extend and expand the toolbox for vector control. The mandate of pre-qualification is the same for diagnostics, vaccines, and medicines to a high level, a degree, and it quite simply is to increase access to safe, high quality, efficacious products, in this case, vector control products. And I've talked a little bit about the looking at the safety, the effectiveness, and the quality of the products, and that these products are listed for use. But what I want to talk about here in the mandate is something that WHO did not have before under WUPIs, and that was now the pre-qualification ensures that there is pre-qualification validity of the products throughout their life cycle. And that is from the minute there is access to the product in the countries, in the regions, until the time when that product is withdrawn from use, whether it's through replacement by another product or any other means. There is a responsibility to monitor the life cycle of the product. Also, the mandate of the pre-qualification team is very strong in terms of contributing to building an assessment capacity of member states. And that's done through either training of assessors from member states, through the actual WHO assessments, working side by side, harmonizing quality and regulatory systems, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, and also supporting collaborative registrations, joint reviews, shared information. So I think at this point, if we talk about new interventions and genetically modified mosquitoes, if you can see that the pre-qualification, or the WHO pre-qualification team does have responsibility for the validity of the products throughout the life cycle, and there's a clear mandate to work with other countries. You can see how there is scope to amend the system to include some of these newer interventions. So next slide, please. I want to just talk about the purpose very quickly. Originally, and to this day, actually, pre-qualification was focused on the needs of the procurement agencies. It provides these agencies with the list of health products, vector control being the one most recently brought into the product streams. But it gives the procurement agencies a list of these products which have been assessed for safe use, efficacy, and an assurance that the products have been manufactured to established standards. And very importantly, that these manufacturing facilities have been inspected. Procurement agencies rely on the pre-qualification lists, but also some countries rely on the list of pre-qualified products before they take the decision to permit use in their country. We see in vector control a number of countries who have very robust regulatory authorities dealing with medicines, diagnostics, and vaccines, but not quite with vector control products, mainly because the evaluation of these products can fall in one of three ministries, either health or agriculture or environment. So it's a little difficult sometimes to pull all of these ministries together to get the kind of decision that's needed to evaluate a product for control of vector transmission. And I mentioned before, pre-qualification team works with the countries to collaborate on product evaluations by contributing to building capacity, if that's what the member states require of us. Joint evaluations are also becoming more common. We work regularly, for example, with Singapore, and we regularly share our knowledge and the information that we receive from the evaluations of products. The next slide, please. I'm very briefly going to just point out one important factor in this slide. Of course, the pre-qualification team, including for vector control, have a regulatory framework. It's straightforward, it's simple, it's what you would expect. It's built on science and policy. And it's supported by, first of all, guidance on regulatory approaches to pesticides, not only for public health, but also for agriculture. And the reason I want to draw attention to that is most of us will know that the database of information on chemical pesticides used in agriculture is bigger than any other product stream. And I know that because I've worked in medicines and I've also worked in pesticides. And just because of the number of or the studies that are required for pesticides used in agriculture, and because there's no professional oversight in the use, there is an awful lot of data. And we rely a lot on that data for the traditional chemical pesticides. But also, that's the data. But we can look to the agricultural sector when appropriate for regulatory approaches. And one place we are starting to look, because our foray into looking at a regulatory process for GMM is also to look at how the agricultural sector dealt with GMO crops, for example. We also utilize best practices from the WHO experience. WUPIS was the previous regime. It was very successful. PQ has expanded the scope of WHO in this area, but that doesn't mean that we don't rely a lot on the information and the approaches that were in place with the previous WUPI system. And then we're very lucky that we can look to medicines, diagnostics, and vaccines to get the best practices and develop an approach that would be best suited to vector control products. Next slide, please. I won't go through all of this slide because of time, but again, I think it's pretty clear from what I've talked about already that in WHO there is a robust, I will call it a pre-market or a pre-qualification assessment of the data, but we also have responsibility, as I mentioned earlier, for work that goes on after the product has been used in the field. So we have site and facility inspections that are carried out routinely, and we have post-market activities. The reactive ones are complaints about products. Every regulatory agency does that, and so does WHO. But then there's a more proactive approach to that, which could fall under monitoring and surveillance. So I think when we're looking at new interventions, we also can look at where we might not have all the information that we would normally see in a traditional product that we know a lot about, but we can use our post-market responsibilities to get the information that we're looking for in a limited way. Next slide, please. So this is very procedural. I apologize for that, but there are some comments I want to make about that. Because every regulatory agency, and as I've explained, WHO is obviously no different in that approach. The information, the decisions, the recommendations that we make must be evidence-based. And of course, a robust evaluation that leads to a decision requires appropriate data, the required data generated through well-designed studies and using standard methods. And in order to get the best out of that information, the data must be organized appropriately in order to conduct an analysis that people understand, and also to be able to communicate that information in a way that is consistent with what people would expect. We have this standard dossier, and it goes for many reasons that I've just talked about, but also because if I go back to Prequalification has a large responsibility to work with our member states and the member states who want to work with us here. So having a standard format in which to organize all the scientific data makes that capacity building and that work sharing and knowledge sharing very much easier. It, of course, was designed, and it's very similar to the OECD modular approach. It was, of course, designed to meet the needs of chemical pesticides, chemical vector control products. But we feel that for new intervention, this would also work as well, and we would be encouraging maintaining this approach to organizing the information. And it would lend itself, we feel, at the moment, the modules include both the data and the information that's developed in laboratory and semi-field testing, for example. But as we move forward with perhaps the need to have smaller dossiers of information that must be reviewed, for example, in the WHO testing guidelines for GMM, we are stating that the data should be generated in phases, different phases, and within these phases, different stages. So we would want to ensure that the information that we get in these different phases and stages would be organized appropriately, and these can be added to the bulk of the information that comes in around these products to help us make an informed decision. The next slide, please. I'm actually going to just skip over that slide because I think it's repeating a lot of what I've said, and go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is really the last slide I'm going to present on given the time, and that's some considerations that we feel in WHO are relevant to the regulation of genetically modified mosquito-derived products. And they're really sort of considerations, questions, but the work in progress, because now that we have the framework of documents in place, we can start looking at the more operational aspects. The first one being, and I think it has to be said, it's collaboration with countries and regions with respect to the role of the WHO assessment of GMM products. I think we all understand that there will always be an element of WHO being involved, particularly through the determination of public health. But the actual assessment of safety, quality, and entomological efficacy could absolutely fall to the pre-qualification team, but we would need to hear from countries if this is appropriate, and if it is, what role would we take? Would we actually do the assessment and share information, either do a joint assessment, or would we just facilitate and contribute where necessary? Or could there be a number of different approaches? The next consideration we have to take is in terms of the data requirements, the protocols, the evaluation process, and then how all that is consulted. That is, I won't go into all of that because a lot of that information, in fact, much of that information is contained in the guidance framework for testing of genetically modified mosquitoes. But we need to understand, we need to translate that, we need to put that into more plain language, and we need to make that, divide that into where we feel these data requirements need to be generated and according to the study protocols, etc. So that's another consideration that, of course, we won't be doing alone in WHO, but involving the implicated partners and stakeholders. One point that we think is important is the inspection, because WHO has a very important role in inspection of medicines, production, manufacturing sites and testing sites, likewise vaccines and diagnostics. What normally happens is a WHO inspector will accompany a country inspector. So it's a joint participation, but this is a very powerful responsibility because it's the way you can actually get into a production site. You can see how a product is manufactured. You can check the documentation. You can talk to the workers that are involved in the production. You can ask questions, verify documentations, and you can go in any number of times that you feel you need to. And that doesn't only happen in production sites, but also in testing sites. And when we think about genetically modified mosquitoes and indeed new interventions as a whole, that's a very powerful tool to have at your disposal. And it may be worth considering how we would implement that to benefit the evaluation process for new interventions. There's also the life cycle oversight that is a responsibility of WHO in this area, recognizing that more information is always being generated, is always being found when the products are used. How is that brought back to the product file, analyzed, and any action taken in terms of a change? And also the risk management plan. Is that being followed in the way that was intended? We also need to consider the non-compliance with approved parameters. Currently, WHO can issue letters of concern, and these are public, and that would state where we felt there was an issue with the product and what needs to happen. That could lead to a suspension of a product until the issue is addressed appropriately. It could also lead to a delisting of a product as well. So obviously, WHO doesn't do this on its own. There is always input with countries. And this, I think, is a very, again, a very important responsibility that could lend itself to the evaluation and the continued oversight of new intervention vector control products. And then we have monitoring and surveillance. And of course, we would never do that on our own. That has to be done with partnerships. So there are many more considerations that we have to take account of, but these are the main ones that we're sort of working at the moment. So I think given the time, the next few slides were just examples. This isn't a technical presentation. We can come back another time if invited and give a technical, but this was an example of where the kinds of information that we would expect in the different modules, and you may want to look at that later on, but we could maybe then move to the next steps, which is about 3 slides on. I'm just conscious of our time and leaving time for questions. Yes, the next steps are fairly straightforward. We now feel ready in WHO now that we have got the 3 main documents, 2 launched, 1 ready to be launched soon, to initiate and to further, because we do consult with countries and other organizations and basically outreach to partners to determine the appropriate role. I've focused in here on WHO prequalification in the area of GMM regulation, because as I said, we see that the role of the determination of public health will always rest with WHO, and countries want us to do that. So it's very much at this point looking at the role for WHO in terms of safety, human, animal health, environment, quality, and entomological efficacy. We continue to learn more from pre-submission meetings with product developers and researchers and prospective manufacturers of products derived from GMM. We know that there's a number of years in the making before, if appropriate, WHO would ever see a submission, but we do actually get a lot of, as I pointed out here, manufacturers coming to talk to us. We learn a lot. We also give them a lot of information as to the kinds of data requirements, and more importantly, the approach and the process that would be required if indeed we did get an application for pre-qualification of one of these products. And then lastly, we will continue to develop the regulatory approaches reflective of what's in the WHO guidance. So with that, I think I'm a little over time. I apologize for that, but I do think there will be time for questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marion, for your presentation, both to Wadzi and to Marion for their presentations. I'd like now to move to the question and answer period. We did get quite a number of them, so we will try to get to as many of them as we can, but then we will also try to record the questions and then that we don't get to, and then we'll try to get them answered offline. So the first question I'd like to ask is, this one is to Wadzi from Andrew Roberts. He says, "Thanks, Wadzi, for a very informative presentation. I'm curious to ask about how or why gene drives have been included in discussions of synthetic biology under the CBD. Under what definition of synthetic biology would gene drives fall into this category, and why is this not being considered with other LMOs under the Cartagena protocol instead of duplicative efforts under the CBD?"
Thank you, Hector, and thank you, Andrew, for the question. And in fact, your question was anticipated by the parties, and in the decisions that are taken by both the convention and the protocol, they have taken into account the need for a coordinated response for both processes. The short answer is that the protocol is only applicable to living modified organisms, and doesn't cover the full span of organisms that are covered by the operational definition for synthetic biology. It's quite long, and it covers a number of aspects. And I did paste the operational definition for synthetic biology in the chat. And also to add that in the discussions on synthetic biology under the convention, the discussions are done in the context of the three objectives of the convention, and which is the sustainable use, the conservation, and equitable sharing of benefits. And so you have a wider discussion under the convention than you do under the protocol, where the discussions are looking at living modified organisms and also specifically looking at how to manage the risk to biodiversity. So the technical details of the risk assessment of gene drives, that discussion would then take place under the protocol, because there is general agreement that gene drives organisms would fall within the mandate of living modified organisms and therefore applicable to the biosafety protocol. Thank you.
Thank you, Wadzi, for your answer. The next question that I have here that I'm going to ask is to Dr. Law. This is from Camilla Veach. If a country has given approval for a GM mosquito for investigational use, is the WHO assessment for investigational use on safety also required, or is this a voluntary process?
Thank you for the question, Camilla. Well, normally, as you know, a country has their legislation that governs what they do and what they look at. So if an investigational application was reviewed and approved within a country, I don't know, but I would not imagine that WHO would then ask for another application to be sent in. We would use the one from that country, unless it was missing information that we felt and we deemed was necessary. But it's and I know you know this, Camilla, it's a tricky question because the country has the authority, and WHO will provide information and assistance or collaborate if the member state wishes us to do so. But we certainly would not want to duplicate any generation of data.
Thanks, Marion, for your answer. I'm going to flip back then to a question to Wadzi. This is from actually our co-host, David Obrakta. Gene drive technologies in some cases might be used in area-wide pest control. Other area-wide pest control examples might be the sterile insect technique and classical biological control. Has the CBD considered these approaches particularly from the point of view of concerns for prior consent? And if so, what were the relevant decisions, etc.?
Thank you, Hector. And I'm not sure if your co-convener is allowed to ask a question, but since he has already gone ahead and done so, so it's a trick question. Yes. So in terms of the SynBio discussions, obviously that hasn't been part of the deliberations, and there hasn't been a discussion on pest control as a whole. And so the answer would be no. But in terms of prior informed consent as a whole, there are decisions that have been taken under Article 8J, which looks at all the interactions of traditional knowledge and local communities. So the relevant COP decision would then be decision COP 1318. So that would be a decision, and that decision, COP 1318, is cross-referenced in the SynBio decision on free, prior, and informed consent. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Wadzi. The next question I'll actually throw out to both of you, and this is a question. I'm going to skip over the one that Dave Obrakta was going to ask for Dr. Law, and move down to Werner Schenkel's question, which actually coincides with a question that I was going to ask, and that is, we heard today about activities under the CBD and WHO. Under the Cartagena protocol, additional guidance materials might be developed in the future. How could practical cooperation between CBD and WHO be achieved to avoid duplication and ensure consistency of guidance materials?
Should I maybe launch into that one, Hector?
Sure. Yeah, please go ahead, Marion.
Well, I mean, quite simply, I mean, it's an excellent question, and we need to be looking, and I think I said in the presentation, more and more collaboration, reaching out with partners and working together, because this is a huge job. You can tell from what I said, we're really just at the beginning of the operationalizing of this. So any efforts to work together and not duplicate and be streamlined and aligned on many fronts, all fronts if possible, would be great. So, I mean, I think opportunities like this are great because it identifies, we know, of course, that the people involved, but it identifies and brings to the fore the real need to do that. And maybe one of the, you know, the outcomes of these meetings can be that we are in touch and we do a bit more of a formal discussion and meeting.
Wadzi, do you have anything to add to Marion's answer?
Yes, and to agree with Marion, and also to emphasize the fact that our decisions also include the need to ensure international cooperation, and we do have mechanisms by which we can ensure that we have cooperation with WHO, and we would look at how to make it more practical in this process. In the event that COPMOP takes a decision to develop guidance, this is still a recommendation, and our parties would have to agree that there is a need for this additional guidance to be developed.
Thank you, Wadzi. I believe your answer and that of Marion's also addresses the question just beneath Werner's on that was posed by Delphine Teasy. And so I will go to another question specifically on Wadzi's presentation. So Wadzi, you mentioned that research is taking place in developed countries with field testing and applications in developing countries. But for gene drive applications for conservation, such as control of invasive alien species, the research and field testing and applicability are all in developed countries, currently the US and Australia. Why is the developed versus developing country situation noted in the presentation the ground for calling for a global regulatory system? Would it be the same if all was done in developed countries, or if the development of the transgenics was taking place in developing countries directly?
Thank you for that question. And I think the reason I had that comment specifically was as a result of the deliberations and the examples that were being used in the deliberations in 2018 when the parties came together. But essentially the rules would be, and the obligations on undertaking the various risk assessments and making use of the information available would be on both developing and developed parties. So it would be on all parties to the convention would have an obligation, and parties to the protocol would also have an obligation to undertake risk assessment and ensure free and prior informed consent in terms of their obligations, regardless of whether they were a developed or a developing country. The context of the need for us to have a common approach, which would then be a global system, or global guidance or global framework, was informed by the deliberations that we were having in 2018, and the examples that were in the room in 2018 were examples of the gene drive mosquito. So that was the example that was in the room, and it was from that perspective that I have that comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Wadzi. I think I'll ask this next question. I think it's probably relevant more for Marion to answer, but perhaps Wadzi, you may also have a perspective on this. This is from Anna Kormos. If a GMM is ready for phase 2 field, sorry, bit premature. If a GMM is ready for a phase 2 field trial in a country and the Ministry of Health has approved it internally, what are the next steps? Can you provide a step-by-step for an ideal process within the guidance presented by both speakers? And could you please walk us through the steps that a research program and a ministry would take, given that it has been presented, given what has been presented today? At what stage does the WHO want to be involved, and how early in the development process? And the same questions regarding the CBD. This is probably something that will require yet another webinar to answer in full, but perhaps the two of you could take a shot at it.
Well, thank you for the question. I think you're absolutely right, Hector, that is a webinar in itself, but a great question. I guess my answer would be, I wouldn't want to give you all the steps at this moment, because as you probably know, that takes a lot of thought, a lot of consultation, and also bearing in mind that we need to link in with already decided approaches that have been deemed to be appropriate. So a step-by-step process, I wouldn't like to answer that at the moment. A couple of things though, again, and as I said to Camilla, if we really, as Wadzi said, we really want to have a global approach, and that would be absolutely appropriate, I think, with these types of products. So you would hope that we would have at least a regional approach. But always a country has got its own authorities in place, and that's why I talked about regulations. So, a country has got its regulations, its policies, its approaches for the protection of its population. So, that's as stands. WHO, where WHO would be involved, well, as I said, that's something that we need to find out. I mean, I think WHO definitely has a role and wants to be involved in providing the norms and standards and the guidance. definitely, I think WHO would like to, is well placed to be involved with most certainly the determination of public health, how beneficial are these products, but also because of the knowledge and the expertise and the broad spectrum of responsibilities, I think WHO should and could very much be involved in the actual science assessment. But we need to find, and when we would do that, well, we find, if I talk from the WHO evaluation at the moment, manufacturers and product developers do come to us just with the concept. So without even really saying when we want to be involved, we find that we are involved right at the beginning. And I think that's very beneficial because we learn a lot. We can then have the opportunity to talk to the involved folks and tell them about the guidance and what we would expect. So one thing I would say is sometimes it's not just about WHO saying where it wants to be involved, because the way the system is set up at the moment is if a manufacturer, a product developer comes to WHO and requests that their product be considered for a pre-qualification listing, there's really no way WHO can turn that manufacturer away until maybe the public health determination has not been, or the public health value has not been determined, or there isn't the appropriate scientific information. But so WHO sometimes finds itself in that situation anyway. But I think WHO would never go it alone with this. I mean, because of the very nature of our job and because of our outreach and because of our mandate, we would obviously be wanting to work at any stage at all with the country and the member states. I hope that answers some of the question.
Wadzi, do you have a question? I mean, answer to that question as well?
No, I think Marion has covered it sufficiently, and we would also, I think I should emphasize that from the convention and the protocols perspective, we would not be producing an authorization, but rather what we would have is providing guidance on how parties could approach, and then also share the information on our clearinghouse mechanism and ensure that they are using the advanced informed agreement procedures, and all the other elements would then be made available through the Biosafety clearinghouse mechanism.
Thanks, Wadzi. The next question I have actually is that I'm going to ask is one that I also had in my mind, and that is from Werner Schenkel. It says, Ms. Mandivenyi mentioned in the very informative presentation that Decision 1419 emphasizes the free, prior, informed consent is required before any release can be even considered. Was this decided on in this strict, I think he's asking this strict form? I suppose, I think the question is, I guess the related one that I have has to do with the potentially populations and what potentially affected might mean.
Thank you, Hector. And again, I think it is. This is one of those decisions that is all decisions are in the strictest form, but this is one of those decisions that one would need to interpret in terms of the national systems and the national elements in terms of how that would be done. And I think one of the things that was very clear in some of the discussions was that the local communities where such a release would happen would need to be informed. And in a place where malaria is a huge concern for a local community, they might not have a negative opinion, but their opinion needs to still be part of the process. And the idea is to ensure that you do take on board the views of all the local communities and indigenous people in the various target areas.
Thank you. I should also note that Wadzi has also answered some of the questions that have been put in the chat in writing. And I think there's a new one that comes in this is from Mamadou Koulibaly to Marion. You mentioned site inspection. Would WHO play a role in certifying or accrediting labs and secretaries involved in GMM, gene-drive mosquito production?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, indeed. If member states wanted that that service, absolutely. I mean, at the moment, inspectors inspect vector control product facilities, production facilities. We could go and also inspect testing sites. We can also go and look at the certification for GLP. So there's all kinds of precedents for doing that. And we find that, as I said in my presentation, a very, very powerful responsibility to have. As I said, we have a group of inspectors. They do, of course, they inspect to different standards: medicines, vaccines, diagnostic vaccines, and medicines are GMP. Diagnostics and vector control products are ISO. So we have inspectors that are trained in both. But most certainly, this would be, and I personally think that would be a very beneficial service that WHO could provide for these products in particular.
Thanks, Marion. The final question that I'm going to ask, it may be unfair to ask this with only a few minutes left, but this one is from David Obrakta for Marion. He says, thanks for your presentation. And I know my question perhaps opens a can of worms, but in the spirit of discussion, let me ask, in the case of gene drive technologies for vector control, what is the product from WHO's perspective? The genetic widget that is assembled in the lab and introduced in the organism, or the organism itself?
Thank you very much for that question, David. Yes, we've had this discussion with many other regulators, and the consensus at this point is that it's the mosquito. But having said that, as we thought that's what it was, we just had a pre-submission fairly recently, and the product was the egg. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
I suppose, Wadzi, if I'm interpreting the Cartagena protocol correctly as being as applicable to living modified organisms, it would also be either the mosquito or whatever part of the life cycle of a mosquito. Would that be a correct assumption?
The organism, it would be the yes, the living modified organism. And if you are going to extend it further in terms of the supplementary protocol on liability and redress, then it would be the causal agent for any damage.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe we've answered all of the questions either in writing or answered in orally at this question and answer period. So I'm going to close now and thank you all for speakers and thank you all also viewing this webinar for attending. To whet your appetite for the next one, we will be going from a global perspective to looking at regional development of regulatory policies on gene drives and risk assessment. And this will be a talk given by Martin Lema at Quilmes National University in Argentina. So we look forward to seeing you again next week at this, that's as part of this webinar series. And again, thank you to our speakers and to all of you for attending. Thank you so much.